Our next speaker is Laird Barrett, who's the Senior Digital Project Manager at Taylor & Francis. He's worked particularly closely on the online platform developments in support of Taylor & Francis Open Access Programme. He also maintains the TNF Publishing Standards spreadsheet and has a direct role in implementing standards like KBAR 2. Laird going to explore the best practice in maintaining and helping to shape publishing standards at TNF, as well as former challenges and ongoing issues. Okay.
Hello everyone, my name is Laird, and as was mentioned, I'm one of the digital project managers at Taylor & Francis. I work on the team that's responsible for developing Taylor & Francis Online, our journals platform. I'm going to talk today about my experience of developing standards at Taylor & Francis, and particularly implementing a couple of standards, KBAR 2 and access and license indicators. So I'm not going to get into case studies right away. I'll talk first about an example of something that I think is good practice at Taylor & Francis. I'm not sure if other publishers in the room maybe do something similar, but it'll be interesting to hear about that. And then I'll dig into the two case studies, one being KBAR 2 and the second one being access and license indicators. And I'm hopeful that as I dig into those case studies and talk about my experience of implementing them, I'll be able to pull out a few interesting and important key points about publishing standards generally and about how we implement them. And I'll just give a quick summary at the end. Okay, so this is something that we do at Taylor & Francis Online. At Taylor & Francis Online, every standard that we know about has an owner of some sort. And that owner tends to be a senior person at Taylor & Francis. That person's responsible for keeping up to date with the standard, and they're also responsible for driving forward the implementation of that standard at Taylor & Francis if they think that that's the right thing to do. We also maintain what we call a publishing standard spreadsheet, which isn't very exciting. It's a spreadsheet where it looks kind of like this, and I'm sorry I've sort of crammed it onto the slide, so you might be able to see a bit of it. But it's just, and this is an old version, but it's just a spreadsheet that lists each of the standards. So you can see COPE here, the Committee on Publication Ethics, when TNF joined that standard, who the owners are. So this is Colin Bulpett and Sarah Robbie, who's a publisher at Taylor & Francis and one of our editorial system managers, what departments they're in, a little bit of information about the standard, when the standard, or what stage we are at with the standard, so whether we've taken it live or whether we're sort of testing it out, an update on comments about that standard, and also the website. And we circulate this spreadsheet to each of the owners every month, and they add comments in red to the spreadsheet. And then we put the spreadsheet in a central place and circulate it to all of the senior members at Taylor & Francis. I think the effect of this is that as a company, we're always pretty aware of standards, and we're always sort of driving forward standards, and everybody across the company knows where the company is at with those standards. I don't know, do people at other institutions and other publishers, do they do similar things here? Yeah, can I ask, what do you guys do? Is it something similar like a spreadsheet like this?
Yeah.
No, yeah. Apologies. Sorry, it's a very non-tech solution.
We do have similar quarterly updates using a spreadsheet as a
Yeah, I suppose we could make it more sophisticated, but this works okay, so this is essentially what we do. Okay, just an example really of something that I think is pretty good practice. KBAR. Does anybody know what KBAR is? Does somebody mind explaining what it is? I do know, but it'd be interesting to hear from somebody in the audience. Yeah, go ahead. Thanks.
I think my understanding is that it's a standard that defines the way in which one is supposed to construct and transmit data about your content in a way that means that discovery services like Primo and Summon and EBS can actually receive it and use it without a lot of hassle.
Yeah, that's basically right. Yeah, so put it in other words, it's sort of a standard for title lists, and the title list that publishers provide to link resolvers and to institutions. Sorry, go ahead, Nettie.
It was specifically built for knowledge bases, and that's the KB and KBAR. So I just want to make that distinction.
Yeah, it stands for knowledge. Thanks, Nettie. It stands for knowledge base and related tools. So I guess it's a recommended practice.
It's a recommended practice.
Recommended practice for how you format those title lists. So again, sorry, I've kind of crammed a spreadsheet onto the slide, and this is just really a snippet of a title list, but it essentially defines what each of these what columns of data should be in the title list and list journals here, and what metadata should be against each of those journals, and how that metadata should be formatted. And so these title lists go into knowledge bases, and it's those and they essentially say what the coverage on a platform, on a publisher's platform is. And it enables linking through to that content via the open URLs, if that makes sense. So it's an important thing because it does enable users to link through to the publisher's platform. So Taylor and Francis, let me just get back here. So the story of KBART at Taylor and Francis is, I should probably mention it as well, just very briefly. So there was a KBART 1 recommended practice that came out in, was it 2010, Nettie, I think? So there was a first phase report that came out in 2010, but then there was a second phase report which expanded the number of columns essentially that's in the spreadsheet that came out in last September of 2014, I think was the month. The story of KBART at Taylor and Francis is that unfortunately Taylor and Francis title lists have never been KBART approved. The standard used to be owned by our head of customer service, Sarah Wright. And Sarah, I think at one point looked into getting our title list approved, but I think it was a little bit ahead of the KBART 2 recommended practice coming out. And the steering committee said at that point, you know what, don't wait until KBART 2 comes, get your title list up to KBART 2 standard, and then try and get sort of certification then. Before Sarah could do that, though, she handed over responsibility of KBART to me. So I took on responsibility, and it was my job then to sort of get our title list up to KBART standard. And get a certification. I guess I'll maybe talk about the steps that I went through to actually achieve that. The first thing that I needed to do was, TNF at least, was to build the business case for for actually implementing the standard at Taylor and Francis, and sort of set out a plan for doing that. It's fairly easy to do actually when it comes to KBART, because having good title list enables linking through to content on Taylor Francis, which equals usage, which is obviously important to people. And also we have customer queries about our title list fairly frequently. So should this be in here, or what's the problem with this? And so there was sort of a pressing need to reduce those queries, to improve customer satisfaction, and also to I forgot what I was going to say. Anyway, to improve customer satisfaction is what we were trying to do. And that was a fairly easy case to sell to people within the company. And we also needed a plan for implementing KBART. Taylor and Francis's journals platform, Taylor and Francis Online, is provided by Adapon. Does everybody here know who Adapon are? Yeah, pretty much everybody knows. They're a platform provider. And the way that we generate a title list is off of the platform. So we create a content slice on Taylor and Francis Online for each title list package. And then we create a link off of that content slice, and that pulls back the list in sort of a KBART format. So what we needed to do as far as a plan is we needed to get KBART 2 development onto our roadmap, with our development roadmap with Adapon for Taylor and Francis Online. So they do the work that was necessary to bring the title list into the KBART 2 format. Those are the two things. So we needed a business plan, we needed a business case, and we needed a plan to move those things forward. I organized those things, and then I went on to sell that sort of business plan and case internally. So I went to a couple of key stakeholders. So I went to our head of library marketing, and I went to our head of customer service, both whom are involved with relationships with librarians and with customers, and said, listen, this is a great thing that we should do. Here are the reasons that we should do it. Do you agree with me that we should do it? And they said, yes, let's absolutely do that. Once I had that support from those two key stakeholders, I went to the person who owned the roadmap for Taylor and Francis Online, who was my boss at the time, and said, I've got the support of these two key people. I think this is definitely something we should do. Can we add it to the roadmap? She's like, yes, that's fine. Everything's great. So we're on track. We're moving forward. The next thing that I did was actually sort of write the requirement for Adapon to do the work then, which was basically taking the recommendation report and putting that into a requirements document. This is a stage where it kind of gets tricky, though, because we do sort of 2 or 3 major releases of Taylor and Francis Online with Adapon every year. Well, release of 2, 3, 4 major releases with Adapon every year. And so I've got to get this development, this work, into one of those releases. And there are a lot of business priorities at Taylor & Francis. There are a lot of things people want to do, and there's a limited amount of development time, obviously. So I've got to argue to get this into one of the releases. Usually you can, in time, you can get whatever you want done certainly at Taylor & Francis and with Adapon, but sometimes if there are other business priorities in front of you, you've got to wait. In the case of KBAR, though, luckily Adapon, and this is a great thing that they did, which I'm very happy with, they decided it was going to be a standard feature that were going to roll out to all of their publishing clients. So we wouldn't have to do special sort of custom work for Taylor & Francis. This is some development that they do to a branch of the code for their software, Literatum, and they'd roll that out to all of their publishers, which was fantastic. And they did that in their 15.1 branch this year, and Taylor & Francis just took that branch yesterday. So it should be a good news story. And yes, we have KBAR 2 approved title list now, but it's not quite the full story, I'm afraid. So one of the things that we found when we were testing the title lists, sort of over the last 6 weeks before we did the release, we took a pretty close look at them. And we found that sometimes when there was a journal relationship in the title list, so whether that was a merge relationship, so two journals were moving together, or an absorb relationship, one journal was being absorbed into another, the way it was being represented in the title list wasn't what we felt was very accurate, essentially. We felt it was confusing. There were a couple of lines for one journal, and they would have different start and end dates for the volumes and issues. And not to fall out upon, if you look at the KBAR 2 recommendation practice, I'm afraid how you represent those relationships isn't very clear in the recommended practice, unfortunately. And I guess maybe that's something we'll talk about later, about the people who actually form these standards and how they have to take into account all situations. But in this situation, when that recommendation practice was put together, we didn't clearly think about absorb and merge relationships. I let Adapon know, but because it's a standard feature that goes across all of their publishers, they want to take some time to make sure they're making the right change for all of their publishers before they roll out what I think they should do based on conversations with the standing committee. So unfortunately, we're in a position now where we've got to wait for Adapon to research what we think the fixes are and then apply them in another release, hopefully just a smaller maintenance release down the road. But it means that I've spent a year essentially now from the recommended practice to getting this implemented, trying to get it to move forward. And we're at the stage where we're kind of there, but we're not quite there. And I've got to keep the pressure on to make sure that we go all the way. I think there are a few key points that we can just quickly pull out here. So one of them is that if you have a strong business case for implementing a standard internally, it's much easier to move it forward. And the second thing is that having super clear requirements for what that standard should be are extremely important from the sort of standard group who's issuing them, and then also if there's development required, handing over those requirements to the developer. So KBAR 2 ongoing still, unfortunately. I think I've taken up quite a lot of time, so I'm just going to very quickly go over one other standard, which is kind of an interesting counterpoint to our experience with KBAR 2. Does anybody know about the access and license indicator tags standard from NISO that's been issued recently? Does anybody mind saying what that is? Oh, go ahead if you don't mind. Do you know?
I would rather not.
Oh, that's fine. Can you explain it, Eddie?
Eddie would do it better. I'll do it.
Okay, thanks, Eddie.
I will be mentioning it later in my talk too, but it's a set of 2 tags meant to be applied at an article level to indicate the free-to-read status of that article.
Yeah, that's correct. And also
along with any license information.
For reuse, yeah, for reuse purposes. So it's basically, and I think Taylor & Francis is enthusiastic about the standard and sees the point of the standard, which is to communicate to a range of people, whether that's funders or institutions or readers, that an article is free to read and the dates that it's free to read if there are specific dates, and also the license information so people can know what the reuse rights are for the article. So I think we're enthusiastic about it, and I think it's something that we want to implement certainly, but I think unfortunately we're not rapidly moving toward it because there's a long list of just practical considerations that are holding us up. Just a few of those practical considerations there are some detailed questions that we need to think about when it comes to implementing the standard. So we've got to think about, what do we consider free to read? So open access, permanent, free, embargoed free, whether free marketing stuff needs to be considered as well. If we're going to put dates in there, how do we get those dates in there? Questions about, we've got to host all of our licenses at different sort of URIs to put into the XML. How do we host those, and do we have all that license information? The list kind of goes on. And I think we've got to figure out those questions as a business before we can move forward. There are some practical sort of deterrents in a way, because it will require us to make some changes in our systems and also make some changes to our processes. And again, it's just finding the time to do all the development to those systems and finding the time to change those processes internally amongst all of the other business priorities. Finally, I think it's, to be honest, I think sometimes it's difficult to be one of the first to adopt a new standard as well, because you always worry a little bit, or I do at least, that maybe the community, for whatever reason, even though the standard's been issued, maybe the community won't embrace the standard for some reason. And then you've invested all this time and work in implementing it, and everybody's like, this isn't actually what we want to do, and maybe we should do something else. So before it's been widely embraced, it takes a real leap of faith, I think, to be one of the first to adopt. And finally, I think there's not a lot of business need pressure internally to adopt this particular standard at the moment. That may change in time, but at the moment it's not really pressing for us. Okay, I think I'm definitely out of time, so just to quickly summarize, internal owners and publishing standards spreadsheet is an excellent thing to do, I think. Having a strong business case and clear requirements to help get a standard implemented, also very useful, important, I think. And I think there can be many practical impediments that stand in the way of implementing a standard, unfortunately, and I think that's probably what we're running up against when it comes to the access and license indicator standard. That is all. Thank you very much.